Whether your officer is unconscious or suffering from a gunshot wound, this is how to transport an officer down. First, let's briefly discuss what an officer down means and the steps to ensure your officer is transported. An officer down means an officer is injured to an extent that affects their current policing ability. An officer down can occur from a car accident, a suspect attacking an officer, or even during a foot chase if the officer falls from an elevated surface and is unable to continue their policing duties. All officer down scenarios will require emergency transport to a hospital. The ways an officer gets there and the immediate aftermath will be displayed in these example scenarios. Our first scenario is a regular disturbance scene, nothing out of the ordinary, just an average call, where an officer goes outside to confront the suspect who's causing that disturbance, but gets a gun pulled on him and gets shot while he's calling for backup, and of course the suspect runs away. As one of the first initial units, your job is to make sure that scene is secure, making sure that suspect isn't hiding around any corners so that he can pop you and your partners off while you're trying to treat your officer down. Due to that officer responding to that call all by himself, EMS may respond within seconds or minutes of the initial officer arriving on scene, meaning they can take over CPR, they can take over whatever medical attention needs to be given, and they can transport your downed officer to the hospital. If you have a supervisor on scene, they may want to ride inside the ambulance or may want to follow behind the ambulance in their own cruiser. And speaking of following behind in your own cruiser, yourself and one more officer might want to help escort this downed officer to the hospital. Make sure to escort that ambulance, make sure to clear and hold those intersections because police cars are faster and more nimble than ambulances. In addition, if you ask any EMS personnel, they will tell you that people pull out of the way more for officers than they do for any fire EMS. So making sure that you are in front and making sure that you are clearing all those intersections and clearing those people out of the way is important and imperative to making sure your officer arrives to the hospital quickly and efficiently. Part 2 of this example is capturing that suspect. Whether you have to do a 12-hour manhunt or you find him right down the street, making sure you have that suspect in custody is imperative and vital to keeping the safety of yourself and other officers and the general public safe at large. Because if that suspect is willing to kill an officer, think of what they'll be willing to do to anybody else who doesn't have a badge and a gun. Example 2 is when an officer is already responding to a dangerous call where backup units are right around the corner and an officer gets shot right then and there. But the suspect doesn't flee the scene and seems to be cooperating. It is your job to multitask and make sure that you have at least one officer providing treatment to the officer down while the rest of you guys organize a plan and get an arrest team ready to take down an armed suspect. Once again, you don't know what's going through this guy's head. He just shot an armed officer of the law. You need to take precautions to make sure there's not a second officer down and follow all policy and procedures to take that guy into custody. But if EMS is taking too long or they're too far away or they're too busy, your supervisor may deem it necessary to transport an officer inside of your own car for you guys to become the EMS. Because at the end of the day, making sure that your officer is safe and sound is key and high priority, in addition, of course, to making sure the public is safe from that violent offender. And before you leave to escort that officer down to the hospital, make sure that there's sufficient units on scene that in case that offender decides to start resisting again, those officers can subdue him and take him back into custody. Of course, you have to go through, and the same as with example 1, clear the intersections, hold the roads, make sure that the roads are clear for your officers responding code 3, because that officer may be in the middle of life and death, and one car accident is all it takes while you're transporting him to the hospital for him to be deceased. So making sure that they go there safely to the hospital is of key paramount priority. Whether that downed officer is brought in by EMS on a stretcher, or you have to bring him to the hospital yourself and you put him onto a gurney, make sure that you follow what the hospital staff are saying, while at the same time making sure to keep your officer accompanied and secure. Because at the end of the day, you're the only quote-unquote family that officer has left. And until their immediate family is able to go to the hospital themselves, it's up to you to stay as close as the medical professionals allow you to be at all times. Once the officer is stabilized, fellow officers or other law enforcement department members may be stationed outside of their door until they fully recover. In addition, supervisors or other officers may come in to either visit or take statements from the officer. But at the end of the day, it is having that officer safe that's all that matters.